Dorian offered his empire to save the woman he once ignored. He had treated Serafina like a role, a quiet wife, a useful alliance. But when Costello's men dragged her into a warehouse, tied her hands, and put a gun to her head, the cold Mafia king finally broke. He walked in alone, bleeding from a car crash, and gave one command: let her go. When they demanded everything he owned, Dorian dropped to his knees. Let's hit pause right here and examine this frame together. Picture Serafina standing 6 paces behind her husband in the shadows of their penthouse. The room chokes on the stench of cigars and bloody money. She watches the man she married treat her like prime livestock to amuse his friends. Does he defend his wife? Not for a single heartbeat. He simply pours another drink. But the bitterest truth rests in her pocket, where her fingers trace a positive pregnancy test. That piece of plastic shatters her final illusion. Proving her captor never loved her, she drops the tray and steps into the October night. The greatest learning is that true survival never begins with an echoing scream. It begins with a completely silent, irreversible exit. Look at how this underworld operates.
The weight of wealth in this penthouse is your lungs.
Serafina drifts through the marble halls carrying a silver tray, her eyes holding the blank stare of a ghost. She brings 4 glasses of straight whiskey because Dorian demands control over every breathing second of his environment. From the parlor, Dorian speaks in a calm voice designed to make grown men shrink. Then Marcus Kell barks like an attack dog. It plays out like a classic tragedy. The enforcer acts as the monster's heavy fist.
Terror before him.
So the boss never lifts a finger.
Is brutal. If you stay inside a toxic room long enough, you eventually start the poison is just normal air. The camera pans to 2 thugs lounging in the chairs, radiating a foul mix of cheap malice and expensive cologne. One of them actually leans back and calls bagging Serafina a brilliant business move.
You can practically see her, they praise her clean background as the perfect shield to keep the police away, of laughing about how she is easy on the eyes. Marcus barks out an ugly laugh that would make your skin crawl, literally calling her a breeding mare. But look at Serafina. Her hands do not tremble. She holds that heavy crystal tray perfectly still. It breaks your heart because you realize she has learned the darkest rule of surviving a monster. The moment you show them you are bleeding, they will only slice you deeper. Never give a cruel person the twisted satisfaction of your tears. Now watch the slight smirk on Dorian's face. He talks about his wife like she is a used car that gets incredible gas mileage. He brags about how quiet she is, how she never fights back, and how he avoids the messy complications of actual romance. Just outside the heavy oak doors, Serafina's mind snaps completely shut. Her heart freezes over like a dead winter lake, as she always knew this marriage was just a dirty survival pact her desperate father signed in blood. She was nothing but the payment. But there is a massive difference between knowing you are a helpless pawn and hearing the man who shares your bed call you a piece of meat. Listen to me on this one. You can build up all the protective walls you want, but hearing the ugly truth out loud will always break you. It brings a pain that changes a person forever. Stick with me here. The real heartbreak sets in. There's so many in the trapped, the dark. She carried a tiny, foolish hope that if she was simply good enough, he might eventually love her.
Hearing his cold laughter strips that lie away forever, she steps into the smoky room, and not a single man flinches. Dorian remains seated, a petty power move to remind her she is beneath him.
The second that they spoke their vows, He stopped viewing her as a human being. She hands out the glasses like a wound-up robot, her gaze pinned to the floor because locking eyes with wolves is a fatal mistake. He dismisses her with a lazy wave of his hand. She forces a hollow smile and turns away. The agonizing laugh lies into your face is that trying to love someone into treating you right is a desperate game you will always lose.
Slowly, down the long corridor where she passed, it used to find cries burned by invisible ball Dorian made her feel.
She drifts past the staff quarters, where every servant pretends they cannot hear the crying silence of a dead marriage. She reaches her bedroom. She pulls out that plastic stick and stares at it under the dim lamp. Two pink lines, a new life blooming in the dark. She sits motionless as the sun sets, letting reality wash over her. When the clock strikes midnight, she ignores the diamonds and designer bags. She pulls out a battered canvas defogel. The profound truth is, the very things we think make us rich are usually the exact chains keeping us trapped. She trading her golden breathe real air again. She absolutely refuses to pack only plain clothes, a faded silver necklace from her mother, and a cheap burner phone she bought on a terrified hunch. The penthouse is completely dead quiet.
2 floors down, Dorian is in his sprawling office, far too obsessed with his own reflection
to notice his wife is escaping. Slowly, she slides the heavy diamond ring off her finger and leaves it resting on the polished nightstand. There are no full speeches, no throwing fine china against the walls. She simply walks out the front door and leaves the gilded cage wide open behind her. Honestly, that is the most powerful move a person can make. Real freedom comes from realizing your captor does not even deserve the basic courtesy of a goodbye. Bound in the lobby, she runs into Miguel, the night guard, shocked to see the boss's wife heading out alone. She forces her racing heart to slow and plays it cool, whispering she just needs a walk to that Nair because Sarafina was the only soul.
He gives the nod and unlocks the heavy doors.
The second that cold air hits her face, her spirit wakes up. She pays cash for a ride to the north side of the city, melting into the shadows where no one asks questions. She is seeking out her old aunt, the only woman who never bowed down to the monsters in their family. It proves that simple kindness is never wasted. Treating people right when you have nothing to gain might be the exact thing that saves your life when the world completely falls apart. You and I need to appreciate the weight of this.
Next moment, her Aunt Marielle opens the wooden door and sees the absolute terror in Sarafina's eyes.
Moves straight to the kitchen. There is no cold marble here, just a real safe home.
Marielle does not interrogate her with French.
Shins is tough, perceptive, and could not care less about Dorian's dark reputation. Sarafina drops the heavy truth right onto the table. She is pregnant. Marielle does not even blink. She just asks if the husband... Sarafina grips her hot cup of tea like a life raft, shivering uncontrollably. She admits she has no master plan. She just needed to stop feeling like hunted prey for one night. Sometimes, the bravest thing you do is admit you are entirely lost and trust the rare people who actually want to see you survive. Her exhausted brain is practically short-circuiting in the dim light, but she finally forces the terrifying words out.
She needs to disappear forever.
When Marielle quietly asks where she will go, Sarafina mentions an old rotting family cabin hidden deep in the northern woods. Dorian always despised that place. He used to march to the land and demand she sell the biscuit's bottom line. Refusing to sell that overgrown plot was the only time she ever stood up to him. Sure, the roof is probably caving in and there is zero physical security, but tonight it is her only ticket to true freedom. The beautiful lesson here is to never let anyone strip away the very last piece of who you are. That tiny, useless thing you refuse to let them destroy is exactly what you will use to rebuild your entire life.
Marielle leans across the table and warns her that a ruthless man like Dorian will never let his property just walk away. He will hunt her down, but Serafina looks her aunt dead in the eye.
And for the very first time, the camera catches a spark of real fire. The trembling victim is gone. Marielle sees it too. She pulls the girl into a fierce hug, telling her to find a lawyer entirely outside the mob's deep pockets. Cutting a toxic person off completely is the only way to truly heal. Meanwhile, back at the echoing penthouse,
totally unaware his wife is missing. And the most pathetic part of it all, he only noticed her absence next morning because nobody brought him his black coffee.
It is a harsh truth. When treat you like an appliance artist, they never actually miss you. They only miss what you can do for them.
We really need to study how a monster reacts when his favorite possessions goes missing. Dorian is not his wife shivering in a ditch somewhere. He is merely annoyed. To his twisted mind,
her running away is just a frustrating glitch in his perfectly ordered system. He smugly assumes she is off pouting and will come crawling back by lunch. But by noon, when she ignores his calls, his massive, fragile ego begins to crack. It is not sadness creeping in, it is pure venomous anger. Then the sun finally sets. He storms into the master bedroom, sees that glittering wedding ring abandoned on the nightstand, absolutely loses his mind. He immediately calls his attack dog, demanding to know if she has actually escaped for good. It proves the ultimate lesson of a broken heart. Abusers never grieve losing you as a person. They only grieve losing their total power over you. The enforcer's silence hangs on the line, a quiet request to hunt her down. Dorian snaps a dismissal, treating his vanished wife as a mere misplaced possession. But as the call ends, we watch Dorian in the sterile quiet of his office. He stares down at her discarded wedding ring, the diamonds catching the dim light. Try as he might, he realizes he cannot even conjure the memory of her real smile. He spent decades building a brutal empire, convinced this tenderness is a fatal flaw. Now, the woman he thought was just a shadow has shattered his reality. It is a quiet, devastating tragedy. We build towering fortresses to keep out our enemies, only to realize we have locked ourselves in. The ruthless man who rules the entire city is now paralyzed by the crushing weight of losing what he never truly saw. Let us pause the frame right here and look at this together, you and I. We are watching a man's ego short circuit in real time. Standing in the hollow emptiness of her room, the crushing truth washes over Dorian. He knows nothing about his own wife. He turns the heavy diamond ring in his palm, a stone he paid a stranger to select. He pockets the cold metal and turns away, blind to the tempest gathering ahead. Cut to Serafina, miles away, actively rewriting her destiny. She sits across from Silas Merrick, a 63-year-old lawyer known for dragging the desperate out of the darkest waters. It is a profound survival. Sometimes the absolute bravest thing you can do is sit at a table, look someone in the eye, and ask for the right kind of boogaloo. The scene is bathed in the muted light of an ordinary coffee shop. Silas leans back, his sharp eyes reading the invisible scars Serafina carries. When her voice trails off, He cuts straight to the bone, asking if she is ready to burn the marriage maid to ashes. Use the flicker of Nishan eyes, the lingering gravity of a trauma bond that fights to hold on, but her gaze hardens. She is fighting for just the absolute survival of her unborn child. Salad the brutal non-intangible reality, fighting an apex predator like Dorian. Her inheritance will simply not last. It is a harsh, unyielding lesson of the world we live in. Old money might buy you a temporary blanket of comfort, but against a monster with endless resources, it only buys you a few fleeting moments of time. Watch her posture shift. This is the exact moment Serafina awakens. She realizes Dorian's power is an illusion built entirely on her silence, and she is done playing the ghost. She does not crave revenge, which makes her an incredibly dangerous opponent. She simply demands our freedom. Silas sees the quiet fire burning within her and agrees to build her legal fortress, though he issues a dark warning. When a tyrant loses his favorite possession, the fallout is always violent. With the papers in motion, Serafina retreats to Ravenshade, a massive stone mansion swallowed by dead gardens. Yet true freedom is often a matter of perspective. For the first time in her tragic life, this gothic stone prison is a place where she finally holds all the keys. The camera sweeps across the estate. The house mirrors her soul, cold, fractured, and desperate for a pulse. Slowly, she breathes life back into the stone. She brings in Rose, a warm housekeeper, and a quiet groundskeeper. The simple rhythm of chopping wood and restoring heat works on her weary spirit.
It is a beautiful lesson for anyone broken.
Sums. The most profound healing comes
From the simple, steady work of surviving the day. She got exactly 14 days of pure peace before shatters the quiet.
On a bitter November afternoon, a sleek black car glides up the drive.
Hidden behind the library glass, she watches Dorian step onto the frozen grass.
The ruthless conqueror looks completely lost. Trapped in her chest is dust Arc money cannot buy or bully. Hit pause on this frame and study him with me. No tie, the collar unbuttoned. For a man armored in custom suits, this disarray screams of a mental collapse. Serafina blocks the oak doorway, refusing to yield an inch. He stares at her wild, unbound hair as if she is a stranger, offended that she abandoned her role as his silent doll. He plays the confused husband,
but she verbally cuts him to the bone. She looks into his eyes and states the absolute truth. Never loved her, only the polished image she provided. He tries to gaslight her with
practiced ease, but she turns to ice. True power is refusing to play a rigged game. The monster who ruins lives with a whisper is being completely dismantled on a frozen porch by her unyielding, razor-sharp truth. She throws his cruel words back into his face, proving he always viewed her as a disposable asset. The camera pushes in as his mind ends short-circuits. He scrambles, claiming it was just tough talk for his syndicate friends, missing the fact that he crushed her spirit. But Serafina stands resolute, a portrait of ice and iron. Her voice does not waver as she declares their transganted dead what. Watching his arrogant mask dissolve into panic is a cinematic triumph. Just as he tries to inflate his chest and reclaim his terrifying presence, she drops the ultimate weight upon him. She is pregnant. The silence that follows is deafening. Life constantly teaches us that control a fragile illusion. Just realizes he sparked a new life in a world he can no longer rule. The revelation shatters him.
Before he can draw a breath, she lays down the absolute law. She is 10 weeks along, staying in this fortress, and he will play on short terms or get nothing.
She wields his own tactics like a seasoned duelist.
When he steps forward using his shadow to intimidate her, she holds her ground without a flinch. He growls that the child is his.
But beneath the anger, we hear the whimper of a man losing his grip. To a narcissist, a child is merely a mirror for his vanity. She hands him a card and shuts the heavy door in his face. It is a stunning display of boundary setting. You do not always have to draw a sword to defeat a monster. Sometimes the greatest victory is simply closing the door and refusing to feed them your fear. Stick with me here, because you and I have seen this tragic defense mechanism before. He pleads through the wood, promising to fix everything, but she knows the bitter truth. You cannot repair a machine designed to crush your spirit. She turns the heavy brass lock, watching his defeated shadow retreat. Notice the framing here, there are no tears. She has crystallized into solid rock.
Later, wrapped in the profound silence of the manor,
she feels the delicate kick of a baby.
That tiny vibration rewrites her universe.
She whispers a vow to the dark rooms, promising to shield life from a shadow. Beautiful, soul buzz, not about brutal burn, supposed to simplify the unbreakable will to protect the innocent. The cinematic tone violently shifts into psychological horror, and she is jolted awake by the terrified whispers of her housekeeper. A shadow lurks outside. Instantly, her hand covers her womb, the raw, maternal instinct to shield the innocent. But the figure at the gate is not her husband. It is his enforcer, Marcus Kell. The temperature drops. Men like Marcus do not negotiate. They bury problems in shallow graves.
She pulls on the leather like I'm gonna die, treating the before stepping into the freezing night. The visual contrast in this frame is staggering.
Here stands a decaying symbol of old wealth, and lurking in its center is a cold-blooded reaper. Life often forces us to stand at the threshold of our own fears, demanding we step out of the light and finally face the dark head-on. Marcus attempts the mask of a polite visitor, but the Serafina orders him off her grounds. Shifting tactics, he weaponizes her unborn child. He casually lists every broken latch and blind spot on the estate, planting seeds of terror to paint her as a sitting duck. But as the camera holds onto her face, she does not tremble. She crosses her arms in quiet confusion. Marcus pauses.
The geometry of the scene shifting. He realizes Dorian
never told his wife the bloody truth of his empire. In a twisted act of mercy, Marcus shatters the illusion. He softly explains the violent syndicate eager to use her as a brutal pawn. The lesson here is chilling. Willful ignorance is never a true shield against the monsters of the world. It is only a delicate blind waiting to be violently ripped away. He frames her as bait surrounded by wolves, but her reaction is pure cinema. She refuses the role of the tragic victim. Instead, she blames Dorian for putting a price tag on her existence. For a fleeting second, the soulless assassin smiles, offering a nod of respect. He sees she understands the rigged board she was forced to play on. Serafina stares right through him, declaring this child belongs to her blood alone. Moving the baby from the twisted chessboard. It is a monumental victory, yet Marx leaves her with a heavy warning. Dorian will scorch the earth to drag her back. In the tragic theater of life, corrupt men do not wage war out of a profound sense of love. They burn the world to the ground simply because they are terrified of losing what they believe they own. Let us pause right here and look close at this brilliant, twisted little the operative drops business cards onto the table. It is a psychological landmine.
The camera lingers on the slight tremor in her fingers as he uses her unborn child as the ultimate bargaining chip, silently declaring the baby is mob royalty now. The to tremble and slips.
But here is a harsh life lesson for us all. Sometimes the very monster you are running from becomes the only shield you have in the dark. 21 days of deafening silence follow. Trust me, that silence is not peace. It is the heavy, suffocating pause before a loaded gun finally goes off. She actually believes she has won, and the sheer innocence of it breaks the heart.
We watch her nesting in the warm light of the kitchen,
chatting softly with the housekeeper, slowly remembering how to know to breathe like a normal human being. The heavy fog in her eyes is finally lifting. In the criminal underworld, however, peace is just a pretty lie we whisper in the dark before the real storm hits. Here is a simple truth about life. When the world around you gets a little too quiet, that is exactly when you need to start checking the shadows. Her fragile illusion of safety shatters into a million jagged pieces. The absolute look-mode second housekeeper looks through the frosty window pane and spots a strange, pitch-black car idling silently at the edge of the property. Stick with me here, because we are about to watch a tragic downfall unfold in real time. She tries to wipe it off as a lost driver, forcing an unconvincing smile. The housekeeper shakes her head.
Sun painting, bruised purples, sheer panic takes the wheel. She frantically locks every door.
And then the tragic irony reaches its absolute peak. Her shaking fingers dial the syndicate. She begs the exact same devils she swore to escape to come save her. It is a devastating lesson. Fear makes hypocrites of us all. Right back into the arms of our abusers. Over the crackling phone line, the operative called to stay locked inside their house. The steel jaws of the trap officially snap shut. As her frame of veil faced through the rain-slicked window as two massive black vehicles crush the gravel of her driveway. Marcus was not making a polite request. He was giving a fatal command. Within an hour, her quiet sanctuary is transformed into a breathing armored fortress. A man with a jagged scar across his jaw walks up to her doorway. He does not ask to come in. He looks her dead in the eye and states that the syndicate now owns the ground she walks on. It is a brutal reality check about how this dark world operates. When you rely on toxic people to shield you from the cold, the very first toll you pay is your own freedom. In the harsh glare of the porch lights, she is no longer a grieving mother. She is simply a priceless piece of cargo being locked inside a vault.
The sentries take their positions in the freezing mud. They're entirely trapped by dawn. As voice crackles like a broken glass, dripping with an exhausting
paranoid madness. She grips the receiver until her knuckles turn white, desperately fighting to keep the guards away, clinging to her independence. But Dorian drops the heavy hammer of his wrath. He twists her pregnancy into a weapon, reminding her that when she put his rings on her finger, she signed her soul to the dark. It is a sobering lesson for us all. You can never truly compromise with a man who views you only as a mirror for his own ego. To this tragic king, his wife and unborn child are not humans to be cherished. They are territory to be conquered. Tears spills over her lashes as she practically begs the man for just one breath of clean air. She refuses to be buried alive inside a gilded cage surrounded by men with loaded rifles. But Dorian completely shuts her down, wearing the mask of a tragic hero forced to protect his fragile family. This is the moment that truly shatters the soul. The camera pushes in on her face as the horrifying realization click into place. Where was all this fierce, protective love 6 months ago when she was drowning in the lonely shadow of his penthouse? The truth hits her like a physical blow. He only cares because she carries his royal blood.
Here is a vital lesson written in her tears. Conditional love is not
Actually love at all. It is merely a cold business transaction. Her only real value is the legacy growing inside her womb. She slams the phone down for
one brief George that it feels like
a glorious victory.
Then she stretches the front glass of the window.
Out in the driving snow, a heavily armed guard stares back at her. She knows she has the legal right to banish these men from her land, but raw survival instinct freezes her blood. Marcus was not lying. She's a moving target in a very dark forest. It proves a bitter lesson. Closing your eyes and ignoring a monster never actually makes it walk away. One suffocating wheat bleeds into the next air until Silas, the family attorney, appears on her icy porch. He clutches a thick leather dossier to his chest, looking hollowed out by fear. Her quiet, peaceful illusion is officially dead. The violent sins of her past have finally found her front door. Let us step into the dim lighting of her living room and look at terrifying evidence together. The heavy door clicks shut behind the housekeeper, and Silas slides a grainy, haunting photograph across the oak table. It is that exact same dark sedan. He tracked the plates through a maze of shell companies, and the truth is a waking nightmare. The Costello family. These are the apex predators of the underworld.
The bloody rivals Dorian supposedly buried years ago. You can watch the color drain from her trembling face.
Like a dormant virus. They never actually vanished. They simply waited in the dark for a crack in the throne. It is a haunting reminder for every single one of us. The mistakes of your past do not just dramatically evaporate. They sit in the zone, waiting patiently for you to close your eyes. Silas does not offer a single word of hollow comfort. He paints the brutal reality in harsh strokes. In this ruthless kingdom, her unborn child transforms her from a fleeing wife into the ultimate biological weapon. If the rival family captures her, they hold the leash to Dorian. She stares blankly at the photograph, crushed by the suffocating gravity of a violent world thought she outran. Her voice cracks as she offers to empty her own bank account to hire private security. She just wants to own her own life. Surgical or bracing. Here is a tough pill to swallow, and true independence requires far more than just a rebellious in spirit. It demands real power. Right now, her husband is the only shield she has. You and I are going to sit down and examine this twisted negotiation together. Silas slides a very slippery compromise across the table. He advises her to let the heavily armed ghosts patrol the snowy grounds, but she must draw a line in those note in the earth. No one breathes the air inside her home, and no one reports her movements back. Then it is like a dance of setting boundaries with a monster. Her stomach turns at the calculating logic of it, but she slowly nods.
Silas shall drive it
into a binding contract.
Her watchdogs now. It teaches us a grim, necessary
lesson about survival. Sometimes, staying alive means you have to sit at the table and negotiate terms with the devil himself. The camera catches a chilling smile forming on the face of Silas. The lawyer got exactly what he came for.
Naturally, Dorian fights these ironclad boundaries like a wounded animal, throwing a volatile tantrum over the phone, but she anchors her feet and holds her ground until he finally surrenders. Yet,
even with his muscle banished to the frozen lawn, the psychological decay is absolutely brutal to witness. The rhythmic thud of car boots pacing past her window creates a terrifying, endless hum of anxiety that slowly shreds her sanity. We see her
curled up on the floor of the empty nursery, desperately gripping onto the fading ghost of a normal life.
It becomes so tragic that the housekeeper finally breaks down, begging her to leave the cursed grounds. It reminds us of a very bitter truth. A prison of your own careful design is still a prison, and locking the doors from the inside will never actually set you free.
Her voice trembles. She confesses to the housekeeper that she is drowning in absolute terror, desperate to feel the pulse of humanity again. She forces herself to drive to a quiet,
snowy town nearby. The camera follows her the mundane motions of a forgotten life, buying warm pastries, running her fingers across book spines, sipping black coffee while watching ordinary strangers pass by. For one glorious, fleeting light, whispering that maybe she will survive this tragedy.
That fragile glass house shatters the exact second she turns to the parking lot. A man is the cold against cold metal of her car, his eyes burning a hole straight through to her soul.
Here is a brutal lesson. You can never pretend the storm is just because the sun peeked through the clouds. The Reaper was always waiting for her. The camera catches the frantic rhythm of her breathing as Mozilla cold adrenaline floods veins. She quickens her pace against the concrete, but the shadow behind her matches every single step. He stays just out of reach, letting the horrific reality sink in. She is hunted. Her pale fingers tremble so violently, her car keys rattle together. Then he closes the distance. He speaks her marriage, crushing any hope of this being a random stranger. He flashes a hollow smile, delivering a greeting from Vincent Costello. The monster is finally real, and here is a brutal truth. Sprinting blindly from your dark-ass demons only guarantees they will eventually catch you when your legs are too heavy and you are completely out of breath. Let us freeze this frame for a moment. You and I both know the vicious rules of this particular game. The operative did not just hand her a scrap of paper. He handed her a loaded psychological weapon wrapped in soft velvet. He saw a desperate woman suffocating inside a beautiful golden cage, watched constantly by a tyrant, and he offered her an invisible key. She snapped at him, her eyes burning with pure rage that a stalker dared to offer her an exit, but he merely let her anger wash over him. With maddening calm, he slipped the rendezvous coordinates onto the hood of her car. The tragedy is beautifully simple. Sometimes the deadliest traps in this world do not look like cages or heavy chains. They look exactly like a wide open door, warmly inviting you to step into the dark. Focus closely on her trembling hands. Every fiber of her being begs her to leave that toxic bait untouched and summon her armed guards. But chronic trauma rewires the human mind in tragic ways. Instead of turning her back, her pale fingers reach out, snatching those coordinates like a drowning victim gripping a rusted blade. She throws the note onto the passenger seat. That night, her bedroom is a silent torturing chamber. She stares up at the dark, her thoughts spinning in an agonizing circle. Is Costello truly handing her a lifeline out of this living hell? Or is she just a disposable pawn meant to destroy Dorian? The heartbreaking lesson is clear. When you spend your life surrounded by wolves, you lose the ability to recognize a shepherd. Confessing this encounter to her husband would be like surrendering the last fragment of her broken spirit. To admit she entertained the enemy's offer would render her quiet suffering meaningless. So the shadows, her secret. At midnight, driven by a morbid addiction to her own ruin, she digs at the crumpled paper from her pocket, She traces the numbers in the dark, battling the agonizing pull of her own captivity. Logic screams at her to burn it, yet she hides it safe. By dawn, she wears a flawless mask. She spends the morning folding tiny baby clothes, playing the devoted wife so she does not fall apart. It is a haunting reality we must face. Sometimes, the beautiful lies we whisper to ourselves are the only things holding our shattered pieces together. Stay with me on this, because this is the exact moment the Greek tragedy seals her fate. The afternoon sun hangs high, the grand house is suffocatingly silent, and her eyes are glued to the clock. Could be a fatal mistake. Yet the human mind is brilliantly cruel when it comes to self-deception. She twists the narrative, convincing herself that gathering enemy intelligence is a clever enemy tactical play. She whispers that merely listening is not a surrender. She snatches her car keys, looks her armed guard directly in the eyes, and lies smoothly about a simple errand. It is a universal flaw in our nature. We march willingly into a blazing fire, telling ourselves we just want to feel the warmth. She elegantly waves away the guard's offer for an armed escort, desperate to maintain the fragile illusion that she controls her own life. She drives north,
burying the terrifying weight of her actions under the hum of the engine. The clock strikes 2, and she steps into the hushed elegance of an upscale restaurant. Vincent Costello,
a silver-haired predator draped in a suit, projecting a warm smile that completely fails to reach his dead eyes. He extends her hand. She rejects it instantly, raising her pathetic little shield. She is only here to listen. He merely smiles. An apex predator never minds when the prey bares its teeth. It is a dark lesson about power. The illusion of resistance only makes the find counter capture far more satisfying. He gestures toward the empty chair, commanding the space as if he owns the very oxygen in her lungs. He casually orders an expensive wine while her trembling fingers grip a simple glass of water like a lifeline. Then he strikes. He does not ask her unborn child, he states it as a cold fact, tearing straight through her emotional armor. He offers a hollow congratulation regarding Dorian. When she finally breaks and demands his true purpose, the polite mask falls away. He leans in, declaring that her husband stole his empire, Manhattan, Brooklyn. He wants her to feel completely isolated, bitter, the bitter gain just unchanged. When ruthless kings declare a war for power, it is always the fragile and the innocent who are left crushed in the mud. With surgical precision, he sits back and clinically dissects her miserable existence. He holds up a mirror to the ugly truth. She is not a cherished wife. She is a painted target on Dorian's back. He twists the emotional blade, whispering that Dorian is too busy guarding her to wage a proper war. When she accuses of using her to destroy her husband, Costello executes a masterful psychological pivot. He tells her she would be saving her own life. There, he applauds her quiet courage, then burns down her illusion of safety, reminding her she depends entirely on her captor. Then, the velvet trap is set to rendezvous freedom in exchange for Dorian's secrets. Hear this universal truth. The devil will gladly offer to unlock your cage, provided he is the one who gets to hold the heavy leash. He suspends the ultimate fantasy in just inches from her grasp, a blank slate, an untraceable, more quiet life anywhere on the map. For a fractured soul, that hope is pure venom. She desperately resists. Labeling his offer for betrayal, he strikes her directly in the heart. With unblinking eyes, he tells her Dorian has never loved her, that she is merely beautiful property used to cement his empire. The tragic irony,
those words break her because she had heard her husband treat her like inventory. This is the devastating power of abuse.
Feastly, saying spirit pure Sonvir will always disguise itself as noble loyalty.
You and I can see the tragic gears turning behind her eyes
in this heavy silence.
She finally understands that trading her life for Costello's favor is not true liberation.
It is merely swapping a familiar demon for an ancient devil. Gathering every ounce of her shattered dignity, she meets his gaze and refuses. Costello does not even flinch, only coldly acknowledging that her window for survival is rapidly closing. She walks out with her head high, but insinuates the deed glass sealed behind her. The illusion shatters. She collapses into her car seat, her hands vibrating wildly against the steering wheel as the adrenaline bleeds away. It teaches us a brutal truth about survival. Walking out of the lion's den alive does not mean you get to escape without deep invisible scars. The suffocating gravity of her isolation crashes into her. If she confesses this rendezvous to Dorian, his fragile ego will detonate and she will be caught in the blast. She wills for each She sits motionless in her car, staring at a phone, violently craving the comfort of the very man who destroyed her freedom. It is the poetic tragedy of a prisoner weeping for the warden. Lacking an alibi for seeking an escape route, she drives back to her glamorous cage. The iron gates part. She glides inside, deathly pale, and lies smoothly to the staff about being exhausted. Life teaches us a painful reality. The heaviest chains we ever drag are the convincing smiles we force just to endure another single day. She locked the bedroom door, her gaze drifting to the shadows. She played the loyal wife and rejected the villain, but she anticipated, she refused to arrive. Instead, the walls creep inward, squeezing the breath from her lungs. You can close your eyes, but your soul always recognizes a cage. Then, exactly at midnight, the silence shatters. The sickening crunch of glass reverberates up the staircase, guttural shouts, the thud of heavy boots. Then, horrific roar of gunfire shredding the estate. In raw panic, she dials for help, hurling her weight against a massive dresser to barricade the wood. It is a terrifying fact of existence. The world will violently test your walls the exact moment you let your guard down and believe you are safe. The camera lingers on her face, consumed by primal terror. She is curled into a trembling knot behind the headboard, whispering to the dispatcher like a ghost. Then the nightmare truly begins. The handle of her bedroom door slowly turns. A cold voice softly calls her name through the wood. He spins that tired lie, promising he merely wishes to speak. She clamps a hand over her mouth, watching in horror as the door begins to buckle and splinter under his heavy boots. Suddenly, the hallway erupts. Men scream about federal agents, transforming the beautiful home into a deafening war zone of flying lead. She is buried in the dark, entirely powerless.
The final lesson is grim. When the violent storm of chaos breaks.
So sometimes the only thing left to do is hide in the shadows and hold your breath. Let us look at the aftermath together. The gunfire fades, leaving a silence so heavy it chokes the room. Then comes the slow crunch of boots. Marcus calls her name, his tone a soft whisper promising the night is over. Moving like a ghost, Serafina shoves the oak dresser aside and to the lock. Marcus stands there, drenched in dark crimson, his weapon still smoking. Behind him, guards drag a trembling boy, barely 25. Instead of running, she steps right up to the scent murdered her, searching his terrified eyes. She asks who sent him, but he just swallows hard, trapped in a cold silence. It leaves us with a painful lesson. The desperate foot soldiers always pay the ultimate price in blood, while the kings remain untouched on their thrones. Let us hit pause because the sheer madness here as well. It is tragic. Serafina asks if Costello ordered the hit, but the terrified boy offers only dead silence. Marcus
drags the kid to the shadows for a brutal interrogation. Knows the true cost of failure. Bodies on air, studied by the police don't do just.
In the kitchen, Rose blindly brews coffee, clinging to the simple task as her last anchor to sanity. Then comes the deafening roar of blades. Dorian lands a helicopter directly on the lawn, a display of absolute dominance over the air they breathe. Yet it leaves us with a harsh truth. You can conquer the sky and purchase a private army, but all the dark money on earth can never buy back a shattered peace of mind. Dorian ignores the blood, finding Sarasuvanaha in the dim library, hollowed out by trauma. You and I need to examine this frame as it highlights the tragedy of their union. He freezes at the doorway.
His voice cracks as he asks if she and the baby are safe, his knees hitting the hardwood. The cold boss is finally undone by pure terror. He whispers a fragile apology and her emotional dam breaks.
She weeps openly, but I watch him follow Lucy. He does absolutely nothing. His hands tremble, then curl into tight, useless fists. He is incapable of wrapping his arms around his crying wife. It shows us a profound reality.
A man might possess the ruthless power to move mountains, but if he lacks the basic human capacity to offer warmth, his love is nothing more than a freezing, empty room.
She recovers quickly, scrubbing the tears away as if they burn like acid. In this dark world, displaying weakness is a death sentence. Her voice flattens into dead iron. She holds his gaze, stating plainly that the assassins were specifically. She hurls his violent empire back at him, calling this bloody nightmare the exact cage he locked her inside. Dorian physically flinches. The accusation strikes deeper than any bullet. He admits that taking the blame cannot repair the damage. Marcus interrupts from the doorway, demanding an immediate tackle meet-it. Breachin pulls her to her feet, though Sharonabast she never is hand. The lesson here is undeniable. An apology from the insistently places your life in danger is merely down a payment on their next disaster. The dining table is now a cold war room, scattered with bloody glossies and flickering monitors. 3 of Dorian's lieutenants wait, including a calm woman who dissects minds for a living. Marcus delivers the grim facts.
2 dead men belonged to Forstello, the 3rd a Boston mercenary. At the mention of Costello, a tremor of panic crosses Serafina's face. Marcus catches it instantly.
He leans closer, his tone dropping to a dangerous whisper, asking what she knows. Usually, she would build a flawless fortress of lies, but surviving a shootout empties the soul. The reality of human nature becomes painfully clear. So maintaining dangerous secrets is a heavy luxury and no mind can no longer afford. The dark truth always spills out when you are simply too tired to hold the cup. Let us step closer.
Because the tension here is suffocating. The second Serafina confesses she met with Vincent Costello. A heavy vacuum of silence drops over the room.
Dorian slips into his untouchable armor, his face freezing into a stone mask. But beneath his calm brow, his eyes swirl with pure predatory murder. He asks what she has done, his voice sinking into a glacial whisper that cuts deeper than screaming ever could. She admits a messenger has approached her in cold spring. Marcus stares at her, stunned by the sheer risks she took. He fails to grasp a fundamental truth about a burning spirit. When a person feels locked inside a burning house, they will
hurl themselves out, even if wolves wait at the bottom.
Desperation makes any dark exit look like absolute salvation. Dorian strikes instantly, turning her confusion into an act of treason. He ignores the truth that she is just a hostage in his empire. But watch her posture. Serafina locks onto his deadly stare for 5 solid seconds. After a shootout, that defiance is monumental. She fires back, confessing she considered the off simply because she is drowning in fear. She wants her life away from armed guarders and shattered a glass. Dorian coldly deflects,
reminding her she met was hunted him for. She swears she told the rival to rot.
Marcus rubs his face, realizing their security is a complete illusion. It teaches us a stark lesson. When you build a life entirely out of fear and rigid control, the people you lock inside will inevitably claw at the walls looking for an escape. The intelligence officer speaks up. With her slicked hair and cold gaze, she dissects the crisis like a cruel equation. She explains that attending the meeting broadcasted a fatal weakness. The marriage is fracturing. Men like Costello are apex predators. When they smell blood, they swarm.
Costello now views Serafina as a loaded weapon. He will either squeeze her until she breaks, or decide she is a liability and erase her completely. That horrific truth settles over the room like a heavy shadow. Serafina's eyes widen as the pieces lock together.
Was the attack a failed kidnapping or an execution? It delivers a terrifying warning about desperation. A single conversation with the wrong devil can hand them the exact ammunition needed to burn your entire world to ashes. The officer confirms Serafina painted a target on her own back. Dorian remains perfectly still. His gaze locks onto his wife with terrifying intensity, masking the dark math grinding in his mind. With a glacial whisper, he orders the room cleared. Marcus hesitates, but waves the guards out. The heavy doors click shut. They stand alone over bloody photographs like a ruined battlefield. Serafina refuses to cower. She swears she never betrayed him. She admits hiding the truth, but is volatile because his volatile wrath makes him an unpredictable nightmare. She accuses him of acting like a billionaire whose prize was scratched, rather than the husband who actually loves his family. It brings us to a vital understanding. True love requires equal partnership and respect, never a suffocating contract of toxic ownership. Stick with me because the emotional dam finally shatters. Serafina unleashes years of agony, explaining she just wanted one breath outside his suffocating empire. She drops a devastating truth. Escape is impossible. A forged passport cannot erase the unborn child inside her, nor the chains cops binding her Darwin's dark world. She knows his absolute control will never let her walk. Dorian stands cold as ice, quietly confirming she will never leave. She fires back, questioning his sudden obsession when he spent years treating her like a ghost. A shadow crosses his face as he quietly admits his massive mistakes. But Serafina only lets out a bitter, broken laugh. Here is a truth you must never forget. Whispering an apology today does not magically erase the years of agonizing emotional starvation someone has already suffered.
For the first time in this tragedy, the untouchable wolf loses his grip. The polished billionaire looks entirely disoriented, running a shaking hand through his dark hair.
He realizes the hypocrisy of demanding absolute loyalty while starving her of affection since their wedding day.
As Serafina embraces to challenge his twisted rationale, the sheer irony hangs heavy.
A man capable of orchestrating a global Cindy paralyzed is completely paralyzed by the emotional wreckage in his own home. The lesson here is glaringly obvious.
You cannot treat human beings like disposable gears in a cold machine and then act completely shocked when they finally break down. Genuine loyalty must always be earned. Picture Sarafina in this exact frame, standing barefoot among the wreckage. Come with me and look at the trembling of her hands. She wants to scream that she does not
need his protection, but the shattered glass and dark blood downstairs anchor her to reality. She whispers into the heavy air that she cannot do this anymore. The clawing anxiety of waiting for the next strike has broken her. She refuses to raise her child in a war zone. Dorian bathed in cold moonlight. Alohi, Owen is cool mode, demanding she return to Manhattan. As to be his visible ghost, she asks him what happens when the bullets finally stop. Does she just fade back into a silent prop? His lingering silence tells her everything. The lesson is simple. True safety should never require you to completely erase who you are. She drops a freezing remark and leaves the powerful boss standing alone in the shadows. Over the next 2 days, the estate transforms into a sterile crime scene. Forensic teams map out the bullet holes, missing the massive emotional craters left in their wake. Sarafina recites her rehearsed stories to Lisa, the federal agent desperate to nail Dorian. She plays it smart, selectively swallowing the truth. A secret meeting with the rival mob. Opening that door would drag her straight to hell. In the background, Rose bakes meals nobody touches and aggressively scrubs spotless floors, clinging to an illusion of control. It brings us to a heavy truth. Huawei deep trauma with soap, no matter how hard you scrub the invisible stains. Let us look closely at how Sue's scene is framed. D8 security is doubled, making the air in the room feel heavy enough to choke on. Sarafina draws a hard line, completely banning Dorian from the house. But true to his controlling nature, he rents a room right down the street. He shows up every single morning, playing the devoted guardian. He's at a kitchen island, sipping his dark coffee. Let Squire's mess with her head. Day 3, her composure shatters. Why are you still here? She demands, her voice trembling.
He softly claims he cannot trust Stacy. She fires right back, reminding him he trusts absolutely no Stacy. The lesson here is simple.
A chronic lack of trust in other people is usually just a mirror reflecting the deep, unresolved darkness we harbor inside our own minds. Watch Dorian work in this exact frame. He sets his papers down, delivering a masterclass in manipulation. He looks her right in the eye and calls her the one person he actually failed. It is a calculated drop of Gizgar, engineered to pull on those fragile trauma bond strings. And it works. Sarafina freezes, pouring her tea in dead silence. The heavy quiet stretches until the phone shatters the Henshinton. It's Marcus with a grim update. The captive gunman finally broke. Marcus skips the brutal interrogation details, and Sarafina deliberately chooses not to ask.
The rival Castesso.
The Heir. It is a chilling moment that brings us to a harsh truth. When we actively choose to look away from the cruelty done in our name, we become totally complicit, complice in the violence. Vezet druzum sam pest, the chosek no score, the The real horror hides in the cold facts Marcus delivers. The Castello crew did not guess. They had elite intel on guard rotations and blind spots. Dorian feels his untouchable armor crack. There is a rat. Someone on his payroll sold them out. You can practically feel the temperature in the room drop to freezing. The betrayer is someone with top access, living right in their inner circle. Serafina feels a sickening twist in her gut. It hits us with a brutal life lesson. The thicker steel the walls you build are completely useless if the monster is sitting inside the house. Just how close was this traitor?
Marcus hesitates, knowing the damage his answer will do. The mole was close enough to track her private schedule.
It is a catastrophic level of betrayal. Someone Dorian allowed near his wife's wife has turned her into a target. Watch Dorian here. His voice drops to absolute ice. The switch flips, and he goes into pure hunting mode. He tells Marcus to tear the organization organized apart to find them, no matter the bloody cost. Serafina stands alone by the window, drowning in the sudden paranoia.
She asks if it was someone he truly trusted. That single question triggers 2 grueling days of ruthless interrogations. The lesson here is
Vital.
trust is a beautiful human vulnerability.
But in the wrong hands, it is merely a loaded weapon pointed directly at your own head. Picture the contrast of this next scene. Serafina is trying so hard to find some normal life, putting together a baby crib in the nursery with Rose. Then the door opens.
Dorian has not slept in 2 hours, ripping his own syndicate apart until
Marcus finally found the infection.
He looks a total ghost. He says they need to talk. Rose clears out. When Serafina asks, Dorian breaks the news. It was his own cousin, Leo. Yes, the exact same guy who used to stand in the penthouse and casually discuss her like a piece of property.
That polite, smiling relative sitting at the dinner table was the snake all along. It brings us to us an unforgettable life lesson. The most dangerous predators in this world rarely bare their teeth. They just smile nicely across the table.
Serafina asks what happens next, even though that heavy feeling in her chest tells her she already knows. Leo had been feeding Castello their most sensitive secrets for months. Guard routes,
bank numbers, the core of their operation. Dorian is actually shaking. He keeps saying Leo was family, totally unable to process how his own blood could do this. He brought his cousin into the inner circle, purely out of loyalty, only for Leo to sell them out for a bigger slice of the pie. Leo had a massive gambling problem, needed the cash, and did not care who had to bleed for it. Hearing this, Serafina crumbles right onto the floor, completely drained. It serves as a painful life lesson. When desperate greed takes root in someone's heart, it will easily burn down every single bridge of family loyalty. This is where the story hits its most unforgivable low. Leo knew exactly about the pregnancy. He knew Serafina was hiding at the estate, yet he handed the rival mob the perfect map to strike. When Dorian registers that fact, his face shifts into something straight out of a nightmare. His own cousin traded out the life of his unborn child to cover bad debts. When Serafina manages to ask where Leo is now, Dorian's voice goes completely flat. He just says Marcus has him. She does not ask what that means.
Her mind desperately protecting itself. Sides, the trails, these, there's only one way.
Here is a sobering life lesson. When you willingly choose to put innocent lives on the chopping block for money, your own tragic ending is already written in stone. Just the thought of more blood spilling makes Serafina physically sick. She begs him to spare her the details and end this cycle of pain. Dorian drops to his knees, closing the gap, and for the very first time, he reaches out and holds her hand. That firm grip actually grounds her, and she hates herself for finding comfort in the monster who put her here. It is the dark trap of Stockholm Syndrome wrapping around her. He swears he will take care of it, By the time the sun comes up, Leo is permanently gone. Dorian walks into the kitchen at dawn, looking hollowed out, and announces it is done. She just nods, wrapped up in total numbness. The life lesson here? Seeking a bumpet. The jobe genies tramonis chasmi juni use never the nightmare. She does not feel shock or anger anymore, just a heavy emptiness. She points out the obvious reality to him. Castello is going to strike back, and the blood will just keep flowing. His voice cracks as she admits she cannot do this anymore. The idea of bringing a baby into a world where family members murder each other is completely unbearable. Dorian looks at her,
and for one second,
the arrogant mob boss looks genuinely terrified.
He actually admits he does not know to do, but his thickness, that absolute obsession with control,
kicks right back in.
He insists they will figure a way out of this mess together. Listen closely to the life lesson here. You cannot fix a poison environment by simply surviving in it. At some
you must find the courage to walk away from the table. The camera slowly pushes in on Serafina, her voice trembling in the shadows as she whispers that they are merely hostages trapped in the same nightmare. And right here, Dorian shifts the tectonic plates of our story. To stop the bloodbath, this apex predator offers the unthinkable. He will surrender to Castello, handing over his territory, his fortune, and his underworld crown.
His pathetic weakness does not care. Tossing the keys to his dark kingdom into the fire is the only way to shield his family.
It is a stunning reversal of a tragedy. True power, we learn in this quiet beat, is never about endless control. It is about knowing the precise moment to let everything you tildrable turn to ash for the people you love. You and I must pause the frame here and absorb the madness of this moment. A man whose existence relies on iron-fisted control is ready to torch his empire. Serafina cannot process it. The trauma etched into her bones simply will not allow her to trust him. She demands to know what happens if Castello asks for more. Dorian does not even blink. He calmly promises to hand over his CD every dim until nothing remains. When she cries out that he will eventually hate her for stealing his crown, his voice remains hauntingly level. We will just pack up and start from scratch, he whispers. For an underworld king, it is pure insanity. But the lesson is as beautiful as it is brutal. Genuine love demands absolute sacrifice, even if it means burning your entire past to the ground.
Watching a predator tear out its own teeth is wildly unnatural, yet muscle endurance proves his absolute sincerity. Serafina is so overwhelmed, she asks for time just to breathe.
In a masterful strokes restraint, Dorian stops dead at the threshold. He vows to spend the rest of his breathing life earning her trust back. This is no longer a twisted game of chess. He feeds oars into the hallway shadows, leaving her staring in the cold kitchen, the mirror, wondering if a monster can truly wash the blood from its hands. The lesson, staring back, is the singular ray of hope in this dark cinematic tragedy. Even the most deeply wired, toxic patterns completely act when they finally collide with the sheer gravity of unconditional human connection.
Is brilliantly black, an average hotel chosen to surrender. Dorian, suffocating paranoia flares. She stay locked away behind his guards.
But Serafina firmly plants her feet. If her life is the bargaining chip, she will be in that room. He fights it, but finally folds. We watch them load into a heavily armed motorcade. Staring out the glass, she watches the dead winter trees blow past, fighting to keep her terror contained. When she quietly asks for his backup plan, Dorian stares into the grey distance and confesses he has none. It is a gripping lesson for the human soul. Sometimes the only way to escape the nightmare is to walk straight into the suffocating dark without a single safety net beneath you. The lighting in this scene is suffocating. A classic standoff. They arrive an hour early, Serafina dropping dry jokes just to keep her hands from trembling. Dorian sits motionless at the head of the table, cold eye scanning every shadow. Then the heavy door groans open. Vincent Castello steps into the frame right on the hour, flanked by two men carved from stone. He freezes the moment his eyes land on Serafina. A sickening smoke spreads across his face. He offers a horribly polite,
mocking greetings before sinking into his chair like he owns the very oxygen they breathe. The tension is an unbearable physical weight. We are reminded of a chilling life truth.
In any room filled with absolute darkness, true danger rarely screams. It simply sits down, looks you directly in the eye, and smiles. Dorian does not allow the dust to settle. With cold calculation, he slides a ticket across the mahogany his entire Brooklyn waterfront. He demands an immediate end to the warfare against his wife. His face, an impenetrable mask of stone. Castello's eyes narrow, searching for the razor blade hidden in the apple. When he finds none, a sharp, nasty laugh tears through the dead silence. He suddenly sees the tragic truth. The untouchable king is hopelessly in love. Castello mocks him, prodding the caged beast. Yet Dorian merely absorbs the venom without a single flinch. It is a poetic irony and a sobering lesson about the human heart. The very love that finally redeems our shattered souls turns the strongest among us into entirely defenseless targets. Here the dark chess match turns petty. Flexing his power, Castello demands 24 hours to weigh the offer. Dorian, his pride refusing to kneel, snaps back and cuts it to 12. Castello flashes a hollow smirk and drifts out. The oak door clicks shut, leaving a suffocating silence. Marcus exhales, foolishly calling it a victory, but the camera pushes in on Dorian. His hollow eyes are glued to the cell phone Castello left on the table. Serafina assumes it was forgotten, but in this world of blood, nothing is an accident. Marcus cracks the casing, revealing the blinking red light of a live audio bug. They all were played. The life lesson here is sharp. Hubris is a blinding poison, and the moment you believe you have outsmarted the devil is the exact moment you spring his trap. The cruelty of Castello's trap is a cinematic masterpiece. This was never a negotiation. It was a psychological autopsy to measure Dorian's desperation. The instant Dorian crushes that bug under his heat, and the weary diplomat vanishes, eyes and asphalt, screaming. They bulge tires, screaming against the asphalt. But reality strikes halfway home. A high-caliber round shatters the rear windshield into a cloud of diamond dust. The scene erupts into chaos. Dorian forces Serafina to the floorboards, curving his spine into a human shield over her trembling body. Two black vehicles merge from the shadows, tearing their backup apart with deafening gunfire. The lesson is brutally clear. You can meticulously plan your escape, but chaos always demands its heavy toll in blood.
We are thrown into the belly of this nightmare. They violently careen off the main avenues, the car scraping through alleyways like a wounded beast. Castello men are fused to their bumper,
unleashing a storm of lead. Inside, it is a deafening blend of screaming metal and flying glass. Serafina curls into a knot, shielding her unborn child. In the flashes of gunfire, she watches Dorian absorb the brutal impacts, and a tragic epiphany strikes. This monster would gladly catch a fatal bullet for her, yet the revelation brings her peace. It paralyzes her. If her dark king falls, she is left entirely alone with the wolves. With a sickening crunch, the pursuers ram them off the road. The lesson is haunting. Love is a beautiful armor, but it is also the very thing that leaves us most painfully vulnerable to the dark. The camera rotates to match her inverted reality. When Serafina's bruised eyes flutter open, the world is upside down. The car is crushed, warm blood dripping into her blurred vision. She turns toward Dorian, but the king is paralyzed, thus suffering from terrifying head trauma. Her frantic screams cause no ripple in his pale face. Outside the twisted steel, the ominous crunch of heavy boots on glass breaks the silence. Massive hands drag her from the wreckage as if she were a rag doll. Gasping for cold air in the dirt, a shadow leans over her, delivering Castello's twisted final message before the screen cuts to pitch black. We are left with a grim life lesson. In the ruthless theater of human tragedy, simply surviving the catastrophic fall is often far more agonizing than the end itself. Come with me, we are about to witness the absolute horror of waking up in the belly of the beast. The lighting is drenched in grim shadows. Stephana's skull is throbbing like a war drum. Her wrists are rubbed raw by biting plastic zip ties, her body shivering against the freezing, oozing concrete of a rotting warehouse. The stench of old engine oil will haunt her forever. Lounging across from her is Castello, basking in the glow of his god complex. He smiles a serpent-esque smile, informing her that Dorian is powerless. He wants the throne and her husband dead. He dares to offer a polite negotiation.
Terrified but fiercely proud, Serafina spits directly into his face. It is a brilliant lesson in defiance.
True human dignity cannot be bound by cheap plastic. It enshrines the upright ballast when the darkness demands you to kneel. The camera
Pushes into Castello's dead eyes. He knows exactly how to break a soul. He bypasses physical agony and strikes straight for the emotional jugular, her unborn child.
That threat shatters her to the metal of the crash. The plastic ties bite to her skin. She tries to bluff, whispering he would never cross that line. Castello remains deadpan. He coldly states he will erase the child without a second of lost. His ransom is brutal. She must call Dorian and force him to surrender alone. When she argues his pride would never permit it, Castello chuckles and forces the phone into her trembling hands. We end on a tragic life lesson. When the heavy hounds of war are finally released, the fragile illusion of human control is always the very first casualty to bleed out on the cold floor. Notice the tight framing on her face. Serafina's eyes dart, running the brutal arithmetic of a mother backed into a corner. Her husband lies bleeding somewhere in the dark. The guards are already rotting on the concrete. The baby inside her shifts, a fragile clock ticking down. It is a harsh truth of human nature. Our highest morals vanish instantly when the abyss stares back at us. She shivers violently, fingers slipping on the cracked screen, but she dials. Dorian answers on the first ring. Instead of weeping, the warmth leaves her voice to regret. Dead ice. Impossible ransom. Cologne. No shadows. The dead air on Dorian's end carries the weight of a coffin. Castello murmurs the address and she repeats the coordinates of their mutual doom. Camera pushes in on Castello, his smile thin and cruel in the harsh yellow light. He leans close to the phone, his voice a razor blade, warning Dorian that a single shadow of backup means his wife's skull gets emptied, a 60-minute clock. He hangs up with the casual grace of a man ordering wine. Serafina trembles. Choking on the guilt of baiting her own husband and trap, we cut sharply to Dorian. Rain and blood smears across his ruined face in the middle of a shattered street. Marcus stands beside him, gripping a shattered arm, pleading against the suicide run. But Dorian simply wipes the crimson from his brow. The light in his eyes goes hollow. Love makes a mockery of logic, pushing us to embrace the fire. The enemy holds his entire world, and the king must walk into hell. The lens lingers on Dorian's jaw, staying set like stone. Marcus begs to take the fall, but Dorian violently shakes his head. The Iceland rule cannot be broken. Marcus stares, terrified, questioning why they would ever trust a madman to play fair. But one wrong move, and the mother of his child bleeds out on cold concrete. Marcus gripped his coat, a desperate warning of a one-way trip. Dorian simply closes his eyes and nods. He embraces the grave. His entire presence is meant to be a sacrificial delay, a slow dance with the mon's ego while Marcus slips through the shadows. A tragic irony of power. Sometimes the only way to save the ones we cherish is to throw our own lives into the meat grinder. A silence and fatal nod passes between them. The hour begins to bleed away.
Follow the shot closely here. This is the turning point of the tragedy. Marcus pleads again, desperate, pointing to the corpses and his shattered bones. But the Empire has turned to ash in Dorian's mind.
The money, the power, the crown, all worthless. Serafina is the only heartbeat that matters. He shoots Marcus a glare so lifeless it silences the street. Dragging a leg that screams in agony, Dorian forces his battered frame into the last running engine. Pain means nothing. He's fueled by the desperate terror of a man losing his soul. He punches the damning coordinates into the dash and floors the heavy kill machine. We often learn the true value of everything only when we are about to lose it all. 40 minutes left. The tires scream against the wet asphalt. Freeze the frame on this agonizing contrast. On one side of the city, Dorian marches toward the slaughter, unarmed and bleeding, betting his final breath on a ghost of a chance. A taunting text glows on his screen, but he only walks faster.
A dead man moving. Cut to the warehouse. Serafina shivers violently, the harsh zip ties biting into her purple, swollen wrists.
Castell paces the damp floor, checking his watch with the bored impatience of a commuter. To a man so hollow, Dorian's devotion looks like a pathetic disease, begging for a bullet. Let this be a lesson burned into your mind. Never underestimate the sheer, terrifying force of a man who has already accepted his own death. When love is the only thing left to lose, a human being becomes capable of anything. The camera slowly pushes in on Serafina's pale, trembling face as she struggles for air. She just listened to a man casually schedule her execution. Suddenly, a flutter the baby kicks against the heavy dread, a tiny, cruel reminder of life in a slaughterhouse. The silence shatters when Castello crouches down, the fluorescent light casting deep shadows in his eyes. He asks how far along she is. When she whispers 5 months, his face molts into a warm, deeply unsettling smile. He begins boasting about his own children wearing the mask of a proud father. It freezes the blood in your veins. The darkest truth of humanity is this: the truest monsters wear the faces of ordinary men.
They smile with genuine warmth, calmly, exactly how to pull the trigger on an innocent soul.
Castello's shadow falls over her, his voice dripping with the lie that this is just a business transaction. He pretends, but lingers. Hungry eyes, he doesn't just want the throne. He craves the psychological ruin of his rival. Masterstroke of cruel. Serafina lifts her chin, locking eyes with the predator, warning him that her husband will burn the earth to ash to reach her. Castello merely smiles, a cold, indifferent shrug. If the king fights, the king falls. It reveals a tragic flaw in the human condition. Those who are hollow inside must destroy the happiness of others and just to feel a spark of warmth. The gold means nothing. The true addiction is the sickening rush of absolute control. Listen to the low, guttural roar of an engine dying outside. The curtain rises on this theater of pain. Heavy hands drag Sarafina beneath a single swinging industrial bulb, casting long, bruised shadows across the floor. The battle Dorines was grown as Borswina stepped into it. Heir's walking ghost, soaked in dark crimson dawn, swaying on his feet. His expression is carved marble until his eyes find his wife trembling on the concrete. In that single frame, the untouchable crime lord shatters into a terrified husband. He snarls, demanding her release. Castello steps forward with the graceful arrogance of a host welcoming a late guest, clapping slowly. The bitter reality of life crashes down. Your greatest armor becomes completely useless the moment an enemy discovers the one soul you cherish. Dorian has no patience for the theatrics. His bleeding body leans towards Sarafina, but Castello is deeply infected with narcissism, starving for an audience. He circles the broken king, his voice echoing off the damp walls as he
digs up a decade of rotting grievances and bruised pride. Dorian's face remains completely dead. Without a second thought, he offers the keys to the kingdom.
The vaults, the streets, the crown, take it all.
But just small vanishes. He does not just want the demands the king has pressed to ensure his reign.
Wint stands tall, looking down the barrel. It's offering its own arse chest to the slaughter. It is a sobering lesson. All the wealth in the universe cannot buy me a single heartbeat when the final invoice is placed on the table. Watch closely as the blade slides straight into the soul. Castello scoffs at the sacrifice, turning the guilt violently onto Dorian. He points a finger at the bleeding husband, telling Sarafina that her misery was built by the man she married. He shreds Dorian's martyr complex, exposing the raw truth. The Kingpin's own violent shadow dragged his bride into this slaughterhouse. The camera catches Sarafina's eyes widening as the devastating sets in. She embraced a monster, and this cold flaw is the price of her love. You can see the invisible weight of his sins crushing Dorian's spine. The untouchable god of the underworld crumbles, his voice cracking as he actually begins to beg. The most agonizing wound we ever suffer is the one that forces us to face our own reflection. Look deeply into this frame. This is the exact moment a man's pride is put into the earth. Castello smoothly draws his heavy weapon, pressing cold steel directly against Sarafina's temple. His eyes lock onto Dorian, issuing a single, suffocating demand. Kneel. The silence is deafening. Dorian's rigid posture falters. Sarafina weeps, her eyes screaming at him to hold his ground, to die with his crown on. But his crown is worthless compared to her breath.
Agonizingly, the shattered king sinks down, his knees is hitting the oil-stained concrete. Castello beams, demanding absolute erasure. Dorian must sign away the empire and vanish into dust. The tragedy carries a brutal truth. Pride is a fatal illusion. When love stares down the dark barrel of a gun,
you either swallow your ego or bury your heart. The lens pushes in the villain, shifts the final weight. Having broken the king, again, Castello calmly announces that Sarafina will remain chained as his collateral. A raw, guttural denial rips from Dorian's throat. He surges forward, but the heavy click of the hammer halts him in his tracks. The negotiation is dead. Dorian's battered face turns to his bride. The dirty air between them fills with tragic fair beatdown. She reads the profound sorrow in his eyes, the unspoken command for her to survive no matter the cost. His cold mask shatters completely, and he whispers the words he hoarded for 6 months. I love you. The ultimate tragedy of the human heart is waiting until the executioner raises his heavy blade against be finally your soul, your sport as his deepest truth. Let us pause and dissect the sheer arrogance bleeding from Castillo's pores. He begins a 5-second countdown, relishing the high of playing an angry god with mortal flesh. But before the number 3 leaves his lips, the heavy metal doors explode violently off their hinges. Marcus tears through the smoke, flanked by shadows pouring rapid fire into the room. A sane man would drop the weapon and beg.
But the camera catches Castello's twisted grin. He digs the hot barrel deeper into his Serafina's trembling skull, wrapping his arm around her pregnant belly.
In his infected mind, he is still the dispute master of the room. It is a terrifying glimpse into the abyss of ego. Some men are so utterly blind to their own ruin that they will eagerly burn the entire world to ash just to hold the last match. Let us look at this scene together, because the sheer arrogance is staggering. The room is surrounded, bathed in the harsh lights of police cruisers, yet Castello stands there, smiling like he holds all the cards. On the cold concrete, Dorian lies broken, begging the man to take his life instead of hers. But Castello just laughs, mocking Dorian's powerlessness. Right there, the atmosphere shifts.
The camera slowly pushes in as a dark, terrifying calmness washes over Dorian. His voice drops into a gravelly whisper, swearing that if that trigger is pulled,
he will personally rip Castello to shreds. You can literally see Castello finger freeze. It is a harsh reality. The only way to make a true monster back away is to make them realize the consequence will cost far more blood than they are willing to spill. The polished facade of the high society mobster shatters in an instant. Dorian launches himself off the blood-stained floor, a desperate shadow crashing into Castello. A deafening gunshot rings out, the bullet
burying itself inches from Serafina's trembling shoulder. Pandemonium breaks loose. The camera lingers on Serafina, bound, terrified,
but fiercely alive as she throws her bruised body out of the line of fire. She turns to watch her husband annihilate the man who threatened her, his bare knuckles raining down in a merciless fury. We cloak ourselves in the illusion of civilization, but is deeply primal. When the people we love are pushed to the brink, we all revert to desperate creatures, willing to tear the world apart just to ensure they survive. Castello scrambles across the floor for his weapon, panicking as he realizes his reign is over. Dorian violently pins his wrist to the concrete until the gun clatters. Then, a deafening crack, a bullet from a nameless thug tears straight through Dorian's shoulder. He collapses, dark blood spilling across stone. Castello snatches the gun, aiming right between Dorian's eyes.
Marcellus bows from the shadows as a single shot echoes as he puts Castello's chest in the nightmare.
As the smoke drifts, Dorian is bleeding out, yet his eyes frantically search the room for his wife. It reveals a beautiful, agonizing truth. Genuine love completely silences our basic survival instincts, making us forget our own fatal wounds just to ensure the person we cherish is safe. The moment the blade slices her bindings, Serafina does not run for the exit. She sprints straight back into the heart of the slaughterhouse.
The camera follows her shaking hands as she drops to her knees, pressing desperately against Dorian's bleeding shoulder. She screams at him, her voice cracking with terror. And this ruthless mob boss, such whispers, confession by shadows,
utterly chilling. She lets out a broken gasp, paralyzed by his words. It leaves us with a deeply uncomfortable lesson. Love does not always bloom in the warm sunlight. Sometimes it takes root in the darkest, most toxic soil imaginable, or forever binding our bruised souls to the exact people who broke us in the first place. Dorian is bleeding out, his skin ghostly pale, yet the cold mind of a crime boss never shuts down. His eyes scan the shadows, confirming their enemy is dead, while Marcus barks orders to clear the scene. Dorian forces himself upright, but this is instantly buckle. It takes the combined strength of his enforcer and his traumatized wife to drag his heavy frame into the armored truck. Inside the dim cabin, Serafina cradles his head in her lap. Her hands are slick with his blood, tears streaming as she begs him to keep his eyes open. Let's really think about this moment together. Desperation is a terrifying force. The sheer, primal need to save someone you deeply love can push a failing human body leagues beyond this absolute limit where it should have naturally shut down. Watching the life drain from someone right in front of you is a waking nightmare. As Dorian's eyes begin to close, Serafina does not offer gentle, tearful goodbyes. Instead, she weaponizes her unresolved rage. She grips his blood-distorted shirt, promising that Trillicid, if he survives, they will have a massive, explosive fight about his lies and their unborn child. His failing heart is giving out, yet he weakly squeezes her hand, a silent vow to repair the trust he shattered. In a getaway car soaked in tragedy, her furious promise somehow keeps him tethered to the world until they hit upon the hospital doors. Sometimes peaceful acceptance just makes it too easy to slip away, but raw, stubborn anger, it gives a fading soul a fiercely genuine reason to stay and fight. The blinding lights of the surgical ward offer no warmth. Inside, doctors frantically gave battle to save him. Out in the freezing hallway, Serafina's face is utterly blank. The human mind simply unplugs when trauma becomes too vast. Marcus tosses her clean clothes so she can wash her husband's blood off her skin, while lawyers move like ghosts to manage the police. Sheesh, the motion is hollow, and her friend Rose bursts through us, pulling Serafina into a crushing embrace. That is the moment the dam finally breaks. Serafina collapses, sobbing uncontrollably. It is a brutal irony of our nature. We can survive absolute chaos by turning our hearts to cold stone. But the very second we're offered a gentle touch, those of genuine kindness, those hard defenses instantly shatter into dust. Stick with me here because the psychological weight of this ring is breathtaking. The heavy fog of anesthesia lifts and Dorian's eyes flutter open. The first thing he sees is Serafina, exhausted and slumped over his bed, her small hand gripping his like a lifeline. He watches her sleep. He knows he dragged this innocent woman into hell and absolutely does not deserve her loyalty. Yet
he is selfishly determined to keep her.
The door quietly clicks open, and Marcus steps in, looking entirely hollowed out by the night's chaos. The silence stretching between them is suffocating. It exposes a deeply profound truth about redemption. Guilt is an agonizing, crushing burden to carry. But for a man with a violently damaged past, that very guilt is the only anchor strong enough to stop him from drifting back into his own monstrous nature. Marcus stands by the bed, the gruesome event with the deadened eyes of a career enforcer. The rival boss is resting in a marked drawer. Because Dorian survived, the entire underworld is now paralyzed by his power. He just won the dark lottery, but watch Dorian flicker of hesitation. He dropped the bombshell. He is walking away. In this empire, handing in a resignation is a death sentence. Yet Dorian stares at his sleeping wife, his voice raspy as he confesses the collateral damage is finally too steep. It entirely shatters the cliché of a villain finding sudden moral enlightenment. True transformation rarely arrives wrapped in a beautiful epiphany. It usually happens because a broken person is simply too exhausted by the endless trail of blood to throw even one more punch.
The image of this ruthless syndicate leader adopting a quiet life feels almost absurd. Marker leans in, warning that the being off the throne paints a massive target on his own spine.
The remaining wolves will smell the weakness and hunt him down. But Dorian does not flinch. His eyes reflect a man who genuinely no longer cares about the underworld's respect. The violent ambition that ruled his veins is gone, replaced by an absolute obsession with protecting Serafina and their unborn child. Seeing the finality in his gaze, Marcus gives a slow nod, patting his friend S. battered shoulder to bless his exit. We are conditioned to measure toughness by who can withstand the most punishment. But this quiet room reminds us that true courage is laying down the sword and embracing the terrifying vulnerabilities of simply walking away. Suddenly, Serafina bolts upright, her trauma instantly hijacking her nervous system as she frantically checks his monitors. Dorian offers a weak smile, admitting the pain is agonizing, but she ignores him. She had been faking sleep. She heard every word of his confession. Her face hardens as she stares directly into his eyes, searching for any signs that there's just another manipulation. He's not because his houses, they can disappear anywhere on the map. But here is where the narrative strips away its romantic filter, and she doesn't just fall into his arms. She asks with brutal honesty how she inflicted on her your deepest trauma. That is a relentless, lifelong war. For a dangerous man accustomed to blind obedience, it is staggering to watch him humbly bow to her grief. He doesn't demand forgiveness. Instead, his voice cracks as he begs for a trial period, a chance to prove he can be the devoted father their child needs. Serafina finally breaks down, confessing her ultimate terror. The gunfire never scares her as much as the suffocating dread of losing her sanity inside his shadowy world. He swears on his life to guard her independence. But then, she lays down an immovable boundary. She promises that if he ever tries to cage her again, she will vanish forever. Society loves to paint ultimatums as the death of romance, but you and I need to recognize the truth. Firm boundaries do not destroy love, are the essential steel beams required to build a healthy, lasting life over the ashes of a ruined past. The camera pushes slowly on Serafina. A dark, quiet smile pulls at the corner of her mouth as she looks him dead in the eye, admitting this entire thing between them is complete insanity. Dorian simply nods, the shadows in the hospital room catching the heavy exhaustion on his face. Outside the frosted glass, thick white snow buries the grey city streets. For the first time, listening to the stage deep of the heart monitor, she feels the strange, terrifying weight of home. Healing is never clean. Cinematography sweeps is an agonizing daily choice. 3 days later, the heavy iron gates of his sprawling behind them is the very cage where she was once a prisoner. But listening to the deadbolts click into place, the sound suddenly means she is safe. Let us step into the quiet aftermath together, watching some embers crackle in the stone fireplace. The housekeeper vanishes, leaving Serafina staring blankly into the flames, her mind still echoing with the deafening pop of gunfire. Pushing herself up, she walks down the dimly lit hallway to check on the apex predator she married. Pushing the heavy door ajar, she stops cold. There sits a ruthless mob boss, wrapped in thick bandages, squinting in pure confusion at a brightly colored infant care manual. She leans against the frame, a tired laugh escaping as she asks what on earth he is reading. He looks up with the sheepish guilt of a caught child. Sometimes, the only thing that pulls a mind back from the brink of absolute darkness is a split second of grounding normalcy. The bedroom light casts soft shadows across the jagged scars on Dorian's chest as he gingerly drops the brightly colored book onto the mattress. This hardened man looks up with terrified eyes, whispering that he has no idea how to be a father. Serafina steps into the warm light, offering a fragile smile, and tells him to welcome to the club.
They are just two profoundly shattered souls standing in the wreckage, trying desperately to play house. Reaches out, his trembling, bruised fingers slowly lacing through hers,
entirely stripping away his armor. I love you. Confessing the obsession was always there. The beautiful truth of this world is that the most brokenest people will bleed hardest to protect a normal life they have even known. And his voice is a low, gravelly promise in the quiet room. He swears he will say it every day and until her traumatized mind finally believes it.
The camera tracks her gaze as it drifts to the bare wooden nightstand, right to the empty spot where her forced wedding ring used to sit. The trembling in her jaw betrays her. She wants to surrender,
but basic survival demands proof over promises. When she finally whispers a soft thank you, thanking him for burning his criminal empire to the ground to keep her alive, the pain in his dark eyes is agonizing to witness. He looks at her face and firmly states she is his wife. It is a bitter piece of wisdom. We often fail to realize what is truly precious until we are standing waist deep in the ashes of the world we just burned down. For the very first time since she was brought to this estate, for the bay brass lock on her bedroom door remains silent. It is a monumental shift. As the winter winds howl against the thick panes, Dorian sits at his mahogany desk, systematically tearing his bloody empire apart. He makes call after call, severing ties,
throwing away an agonizing extraction, but then he stops. He catches movement through the frost in his glass. Down in the snow-covered garden, Serafina is walking slowly,
her pale hand resting protectively over her swelling stomach. Tense shoulders drop. The ultimate lesson of a ruined man is simply this. True power is never found in the things you conquer and hoard, but in the fragile things you are completely willing to surrender. The camera frames Marsa's sunlit foyer like a dark stain on a white canvas. Dorian's oldest soldier begs him to go on the offensive, warning that the rival families smell weakness. But Dorian does not even blink. He stands tall, his voice completely hollow, declaring that the old life is buried. Look closely at the sharp tightening of Marcus's jaw, and you can see the poison of resentment taking root. Meanwhile, the oblivious couple drifts through a beautiful dream.
They spend afternoons reviewing ultrasound scans and whispering over baby names, wanting so desperately to be ordinary. But life teaches a very cruel lesson to those who walk in the shadows.
A sudden burst of perfect happiness is almost always a carefully laid trap for absolute tragedy. It is a freezing, quiet night in late February when the earth shifts beneath his feet. The firelight dances across Serafina's face as she sits in the dusty library,
calmly suggesting they renew their wedding vows. Dorian literally stops breathing. The heavy crystal glass in his hand trembles just a fraction. This is a woman who was dragged to the altar in tears.
And now she is looking at the monster in the room and choosing to hold his hand. No ultimatums. She is Making a deliberate choice, he manages to ask her when, his voice thick with raw desperation. She smiles softly, promising they will do it right after the baby arrives. You can feel the tragic weight in the room, reminding us of a harsh reality. Whenever you finally dare to speak your happy ending aloud, is always listening. Stick with
Me, because this is the exact frame the world ends. It's beautiful. He genuinely believes they have outrun the devil.
But equilibrium does not exist in a tragedy. On a bitterly cold March night, the sickening crash of shattered glass rips through the silent mansion. Serafina's heart jumps. She calls his name, and his panicked voice barks at her to stay hidden. Then comes the deafening crack of a gunshot. Fear completely overrides logic. She disobeys, running barefoot down the grand staircase, only to find the man who promised her tomorrow bleeding out on the cold marble floor. The brutal truth of the universe remains undefeated. You can run from your darkest sins all you want, but they always know your address. The camera tilts up from the spreading pool of blood. Standing there in the pale moonlight is Leo, his biological cousin, the man whose empty coven Dorian had buried. Leo tilts his head, a twisted smile creeping across his face as he whispers a greeting. Serafina stands paralyzed on the bottom step. Her trembling fingers grip the banister as she tries to process. A dead man is tracking muddy footprints through her hall. She gasps that he is supposed to be in the ground. Leo releases a hollow, scraping laugh, and he smoothly confessed that his demise was just a masterclass in theater, flawlessly directed by Marcus. The hardest pill
to swallow in life is watching the ghost of your past violently stealing the only future you truly wanted.
Dorian's skin is turning an awful, translucent grey. His ragged breathing rattles in his chest, yet the venomous hatred in his eyes could burn through the floorboards. He spits out blood, accusing his cousin of orchestrating the nightmare. Leo drops into a low crouch. He leans in close, as happily admitting he was the rat, leading their secrets to the cartel.
But the fatal blow is not the gunshot. Leo softly reveals Marcus was easily bought. The loyal soldier took a heavy bribe to fake the execution. Leo whispers that loyalty is a myth.
Because every human soul has a price tag, it is a terrifying realization in this world. The steady, trusted hand that guides you to absolute safety is often the very same hand secretly sharpening that ultimately cuts your throat. The gravity of the betrayal suffocates the soldier who pulled Dorian from the wreckage, was the architect of their doom. Dorian chokes, gripping his side, demanding to know where Marcus is. Leo weaves his pistol with agonizing indifference, noting Marcus is a goose on a beach somewhere. Then, with chilling calmness, he aims the barrel right between Dorian's eyes. Without a breath of hesitation, Serafina throws her pregnant body directly into the line of fire. She shields the broken man behind her. Trembling hands raised, Leo stares at her, stating the cold mathematics of the streets. The king must fall. It is a painful truth of survival. Deep love often demands the ultimate sacrifice, requiring one beating heart to stop it entirely so another can simply keep on beating. We have watched countless characters break, but this moment is transcendent. Serafina does not scream. She stares down the barrel and coldly offers a trade. She presents the brutal math. She is carrying the air. Killing Dorian gives Leo a corpse, but taking her gives him the ultimate prize. Leo lowers the weapon, baffled. He asks why she would die for the monster who locked her in a cage. Tears finally spill over her pale cheeks. Catching the moonlight, it is no longer trauma binding them, She looks at the bleeding man who took a bullet to give her a future naturally, and she liberates him. You and I must remember this truth, but testimony. The most beautiful, redemptive chapters of our lives often begin the exact moment we finally stop running away from our deepest, ugliest scars. She never utters a word of defiance.
Watch her eyes instead locking on to Leo with the feral certainty of a cornered mother. She silently declares Dorian is the father of her childhood,
and she will not let him die. Leo pauses, studying the iron in her gaze. Then his voice drops to a dead, hollow rattle. He wants no leverage or territory. He just wants to vanish, and to do that, every loose end must burn. He calls it an execution and pulls back the hammer. That click echoes like a guillotine. In that split second, Serafina's civilized shatters, leaving only raw, violent instincts as her fingers close over a solid brass statue. It is a simple lesson never stand between a desperate mother and the unborn child she's fighting to save. She swings the brass statue, Leo in the temple, with a sickening crack. He stumbles, sending a stray bullet into the ceiling. She lunges again, knocking the weapon away. As she dives for it, his bloody hand
wraps around her ankle, yanking her backward. She slams against the floor, landing directly on her swollen stomach. The blinding agony that tears through her is pure nightmare.
Yet, she operates entirely on raw survival. She twists, driving her heel violently into his face and crushing his nose. Her trembling fingers finally close around the cold steel. She rolls over and fires a single, fatal blast straight into his chest. It teaches us a deeply human truth.
Sometimes staying alive means becoming exactly what the darkest moments demand. Listen closely, because fate loves to deal its cruelest hands. Leo bleeds out on the floor, his final breaths spent mocking the woman who just ended him.
A few feet away,
Serafina lies curled in agony. Her breathing is incredibly shallow, her body destroyed while premature labor violently begins. And then there is Dorian.
The ruined kingpin presses against the bleeding using defense to dial a cracked phone. He barks order ambulance like he is commanding an army. The bitterest
part of this bloody scene is probably just about outlasting the burn to it is staring at the absolute wreckage around you.
Feeling your life slip away and deciding exactly who is worth dying for.
You and I need to stop right here. Look at the tragic madness of this picture. Dorian is rapidly bleeding to death on the floor, yet he desperately tries to command the universe.
He promised her she will be fine, attempting to dictate a reality he has absolutely no power over. The heavy irony, Serafina is drowning in catastrophic trauma, yet she reaches for the very monstrosity who dragged her into this nightmare.
The orchestrated her ruin is suddenly her only safe harbor. It is a raw, terrifying picture of human nature.
The simplest truth is that crisis always burns away the illusion of independence. When the world ends, hearts instinctively cling to whatever warm body is closed, even if they built the very cage we are trapped in. Let the camera run for 6 agonizing minutes. When you are bleeding out on cold tile, that time stretches into eternity. Paramedics swarm the room, attempting to pull them apart. But Dorian fights like a madman. His chest is torn open, yet he violently refuses their help unless he can keep his eyes glued to her. They violently feel surrender to his demands, not out of respect, but because she is the only anchor keeping him alive.
Cut to the tight, frantic space of the ambulance. Sirens wail as Serafina's limp hand stays locked in his.
His terrifying facade melts entirely as he watches the monitors scream over her crashing vitals. The lesson here is profoundly sobering. absolute roles, just a pathetic little tale we tell ours right up until the biology arrives to collect the final debt. Watch this tragic collision at the bright hospital doors. Dorian barks frantic orders at Serafina to stay awake while treating her fading pulse like a subordinate he can still micromanage. Through blinding agony, she lets out a dark, broken laugh, the haunting sound of a mind fracturing under trauma. The true devastation hits when the medical team physically severs their grip, slamming the surgical doors in his face.
This untouchable human is paralyzed by some simple locked door. As the fatal wound weeping from his own chest.
His inability to smash through that boundary destroys his universe. It reveals a bitter truth we all face. The most agonizing pain does not come from torn flesh, but from being helplessly separated from the one soul you believed was yours to protect. Physical reality finally steps in to collect its toll. Hypovolemic shock crashes over Dorian, blurring his vision and forcing the shouting man into silence. As doctors struggle to pack his wound, he feels none of the physical torment. His mind loops obsessively on one crushing failure he could not protect, the only thing that mattered. The camera cuts to Serafina, waking up alone under blinding lights. She does not scream. She merely places a trembling hand on her stomach, registering the devastating emptiness where her child used to be. It is a quiet, soul-crushing beat that rips the breath from your lungs. It teaches us something profound about human grief. The worst trauma rarely announces itself with a dramatic scream. Often, it just sits quietly in the dark, heavy and entirely silent.
You and I need to tread lightly here because the emotion is blinding. The second Serafina realizes her child was cut from her body, pure maternal panic ignites. A nurse delivers the stats, a baby boy.
Barely 4 pounds, sealed in an incubator. Watch her reaction carefully. Serafina is bleeding internally, her life hanging by a thread, yet she fiercely rejects her trauma. When doctors order her to stay down, she physically fights them. Her shattered universe narrows to finding that fragile infant. The staff battles her primal instinct, but protocol means nothing to a desperate mother. The tragic beauty of this moment leaves us with a profound lesson. When you are terrified for a life you love, your own body ceases to matter. Love will gladly let you ignore your own wounds to save them. By the time they push her into the humming neonatal unit, her mind is tearing at the seams. Then she sees the incubator. The boy is incredibly small, an unfinished life sustained by a brutal maze of plastic tubes. The crushing blow is the physical barrier she can't knock bound, amid only the briefest brush of skin. But the instant her trembling fingers slip through the plastic port, the tiny infant instinctively wraps his microscopic hand around hers. That connection hits like a freight train, instantly halting her psychological free fall. That fragile grip becomes her absolute salvation. It is a beautiful, aching proof of our humanity. In our darkest hours, the frailest touch from someone we love is the only thing stopping our minds from shattering into a million unrecoverable pieces. She leans against the plastic box, whispering a fierce command for the boy to live. 4 hours later, a bleeding villain finally forces his eyes open. True to his nature, Dorian's immediate reaction is pure, aggressive rebellion. He violently rips the intravenous lines from his arm, demanding the location of his wife and son like a general barking orders. The staff affirms they survived, and the crushing weight of relief to scream causes his monitors to scream as his blood pressure drops. They order him to stay in bed, but he violently rejects the boundary. We watch a universal truth unfold. When a person feels entirely helpless, they will always choose to drag themselves through blinding physical agony rather than sit quietly and drown in their own terrifying vulnerability. The nurse sees the madness burning in his eyes and rolls over a wheelchair. Dorian willingly swallows unimaginable physical torture to be pushed down the hallway, driven by an obsessive need to reclaim his family. Their reunion in the NICU is a breathtaking masterclass in trauma bonding. They exchanged broken words of survival.
Seraphina's completely hollowed out,
terrified by how dangerously small their son is.
Dorian rewrites the script. He looks at the struggling infant and declares him a fighter,
matching her own brutal resilience. This exposes the dark reality of human connection. Shared suffering does not always push people apart. Often, it acts as the tragic superglue need to hold two completely broken souls together. Come with me, because the emotional shift here is devastating. When Seraphina calls out his blind arrogance, Dorian finally drops the mask. He confesses he has no grand plan, relying solely on his trademark confidence to keep panic at bay.
Anchored together in the cold room, they watch their tiny son fight a literal war to draw a single breath.
This fragile struggle triggers a collapse inside Dorian. The impenetrable kingpin watches his entire violent worldview shatter. We are left with a profound realization. Even a relationship built on toxic control can unexpectedly evolve into agonizing vulnerability. It is pure poetic justice. The very architect of fear is finally standing there, completely paralyzed by the sheer terror of losing the one thing he actually loves. The camera pans across the dim nursery, capturing the shadows on Dorian's face. Naming this child is pure psychological warfare. Through endless nights of insomnia, this ruthless kingpin dismantles his illicit empire, desperate for a clean slate. He names the boy Vale, honoring Seraphina's bloodline over his own dark legacy. It is a terrifying way of tethering her to his soul forever. He validates her trauma, admitting her family gave her the iron will to survive his tyranny. When she weeps in pure acceptance, the scene captures the absolute peak of Stockholm Syndrome. The life lesson is profound. Then finding genuine peace energizes us to often to execute our massive egos and quietly honor the unshakable strength of the people we once tried to break.
Step into this suffocating hospital room
with me.
For 21 agonizing days, the infant remains trapped in an incubator. The coping mechanisms here are wildly absurd. We see Dorian,
a feared crime boss, sitting under harsh lights, reading financial spreadsheets aloud as if presenting to a boardroom. Beside him, Seraphina relies on survival instincts, singing old lullabies to keep the rhythm of the heart monitor alive. Inside this isolated box, they bizarrely morph into ordinary, anxious parents. Outside these walls, his criminal empire is burning to the ground under a massive Latina crackdown. It is highlighted as a beautifully simple life lesson. When your entire world is collapsing into ash, the human mind will always find one tiny, fragile thing to fiercely protect. The framing of this sequence drips with tragic irony. Dorian's entire value system is completely flipped. His loyal men are dead. His rivals have vanished, and the police are tearing apart the massive syndicate he built. A textbook narcissist would be tearing up the city streets, doing desperate damage control. But the camera lingers on Dorian, and he simply does not care. He shows zero interest in his burning throne. His terrifying brainpower is shrunk down to fit inside one tiny hospital room. On the 22nd day, the doctors finally declare the child kept quiet on his own. It reveals a powerful life lesson about human nature. The intimidating empires we spend our lives violently building mean absolutely nothing when a single fragile heartbeat is on the line.
Let the camera pause right here on this perfectly scrubbed nursery. There is not a single drop of blood left to show the absolute massacre it took to reach this moment. Serafina is rocking the baby.
But if you look closely at her eyes, it is not joy. It is just the terrifying, fragile hope that nobody will die today. The lens pans over to Dorian in the doorway. Staring quietly at the exact golden cage he built, he drops all the brutal violence that made him an underworld king just to play house. Here is the beautifully tragic irony of the scene. Sometimes, the darkest obsessions do not disappear. They just put on a sweater and pivot to a quieter target. The simple life lesson is chilling. The monsters do not leave the shadows. They just move into our living rooms.
Watch the blocking in the sequence closely. She quietly invites him in. This terrifying mob boss literally drops to the hardwood floor like a beaten dog, and she actually thanks him.
Do not let that devastating detail slip by. She is looking at the exact man who built her psychological prison, crying tears of gratitude because he finally decided to stop torturing her. That is the heartbreaking peak of the trauma bond. He looks at the infant, sees his own reflection, and suddenly feels like he belongs. It is enough to make you sick, yet it completely shatters your heart. The life lesson is haunting but true. We spend so much time running from pain. We eventually accept confusing the absence of violence for actual love, and we start calling our darkest cages a home. The cinematic glow fades instantly, and reality, it's like a freight train. The child is screaming his lungs out every 2 hours. The camera tracks Serafina as a walking ghost, surviving on pure exhaustion. Savor this heavy irony. Dorian, a man who used to run an illicit syndicate without breaking a sweat, is absolutely terrified of a crying baby. The sheer helplessness crushes his ego more than a rival gang ever could. In a drastic move, he liquidates his Manhattan empire and burns his entire criminal network to the ground. It is absolute madness, but the simple life lesson shining through the smoke is undeniable. Sometimes, violently stripping away every single ounce of our perceived power is the only way to figure out who we actually are beneath the armor. Freeze the frame on Dorian, bathed in the cold bleed of the Terra Tusket at dusk. A classic narcissist never surrenders without a reason. He kept just enough cash to ensure his son rules the world, but through the violent and life becomes his fine. It mimics the look of love, but it is just conditioned survival, hiding behind a soft smile. He speaks the quiet truth. A year ago, he was a god in an iron fortress. Today, his universe is dictated by baby wipes and feeding stools. It is a bit a pill for his ego, but the simple life lesson is profound. Our truest evolution usually hides in the incredibly boring, mundane routines we try so desperately to escape. This is the pivotal scene where the emotional cards are finally on the table. She asks, her voice trembling, if he misses being the king of the underworld. He admits he misses the cold certainty of being a monster, because underneath all that brutal power, he was completely hollow. Now,
the exhausting mess of family life is the only real thing he has ever felt. Serafina quietly rests head on his shoulder, right there as Stockholm Syndrome hardens into a tragic,
permanent reliance.
The sky bleeds into a deep purple. The baby sleeps, and they pretend this beautiful lie is normal. It forces us to swallow a very uncomfortable life lesson.
The deepest, most unshakable connections we make in this world are often forged in the exact fires that were meant to burn us alive. Watch the tragic transformation as this shifts from a hostage situation to a permanent choice. They stop running and decide to lock themselves together. A year later, the camera captures a stark vow renewal on the estate. Look closely at the empty space. There are no glamorous socialites, just a lawyer, an enforcer, and the housekeeper. The baby sleeps right through the bizarre ritual. For a man whose ego used to demand an audience of thousands, this quiet ceremony is a visual showpiece. There are no theatrical declarations, just two incredibly broken
People trying to glue their jagged pieces together into something resembling a family. The life lesson here is incredibly simple. Real commitment is never about the grand
public gestures. It is about choosing to stay long after the audience is gone. Mix as he delivers his vows, as he voices of promising to finally look at her as a human being instead of property. He thanks her for running away, admitting her terror was the only thing capable of waking his conscience. The camera pushes in as Serafina breaks down, crying an agonizing smile of total surrender. She fights through her conditioned panic, promising to give him space to change. They exchange plain gold bands, throwing away their history of luxury. When they kiss, it is not romantic. It is desperate, like two people drowning in an ocean, holding on to each other for one last breath of air. The life lesson is undeniable. Profound vulnerability, even when it is born from absolute trauma, can ultimately become almost a defining truth. The cameraman's exists, and the cinematic irony is thick enough to choke on. When the baby cries, Serafina steps in to soothe him.
Doria reflexively wraps a heavy arm around her waist,
marking his territory while thanking his former goons from legends pretend to be a normal family.
Silas raises a glass to
second chances, and the twisted choir echoes the sentiment. They are standing in the sunlight, eating and collectively agreeing to bury the severe psychological violence that brought them together. It is an absolute masterpiece of human denial.
The life lesson in this frame is chilling. Sometimes survival requires delusion.
Because facing the stark reality of what we have survived would completely tear us apart. You and I need to pause and analyze this devastating moment. The room is quiet, filled only by the crackle of the fireplace. Serafina pulls out a crumpled letter she wrote years ago when she was trying to escape a literal manifesto of her pain. Dorian asks if he should read it, but she shakes her head. She walks straight to the flames and drops it in. She is torching her righteous anger because the truth threatens the fragile illusion they built. She watches her desperation turn into ash.
Dorian watches her do it, his eyes revealing he knows she's killed the last piece of her independence for him. So, steps close, swearing he has changed. The life lesson here is brutal.
Sometimes we destroy the truest parts of ourselves just to keep the people we are terrified of losing. The subtle brilliance of this scene shines as he plays the vulnerability card. He admits this. He is not sure if he's a good man yet, but he is trying. Her conditioning kicks in and she validates him. Hey, he pulls her against his chest. They stand there like two frozen statues in the dim light, completely dependent on each other while the leaves die outside. The camera cuts ahead 5 years. We see the seer Dunn running across the yard, completely unaware of the dark trauma he was born from. Serafina views that night by the fire as the real moment they became a family, deliberately ignoring the legal vows and the agony of her past.
It is fascinating how the human brain edits history, but life teaches us something profound here.
Our most defining transformations are rarely the ones we celebrate in public.
Once she burned that letter, her old self was officially dead. She transformed into the perfect matching puzzle piece for her abuser.
And Dorian, he did not lose his god complex.
He just aimed it at the playground. He became the ultimate hyper-controlling super dad, coaching Little League, cooking gourmet meals, replacing mafia hits with bedtime stories.
The obsession with control is still there, just wearing an apron. Over 3 years, they have another girl, Marielle, and a surprise boy named Silas. Think about that for a second.
She named her son after the lawyer who helped her escape. His ghost is tribute to the freedom she threw away. The lesson is simple, sir, but sharp.
But your core nature rarely shifts its shape.
The estate basically turns into a high-end terrarium for their weird little family experiment. Rose stops being just an employee and essentially becomes the surrogate grandmother.
The dead gardens are brought back to life, perfectly mirroring how these two patched up their shattered minds. Inside this bubble, Sarafina finally accepts her final form. She stops seeing herself as a victim or a hostage and fully embraces the role of a survivor who won the ultimate war. Sure, they still fight. You cannot put two deeply damaged people in a box without some sparks, but they make their own twisted piece. And the real lesson we pull from watching this? People do not need a healthy reality to survive. They just need a reality they can both agree to believe in. Let us pause on this absolute final frame. He sneaks up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist in a move that screams ownership, and asks what she is thinking. She sighs, glad they made it.
She asks us what would have happened if she never tried to run away. His answer is ice cold. They both would have destroyed each other.
She tries to take the credit, calling her escape the move that saved them. But watch his face. He corrects her instantly. He tells her that coming back to him was the real victory. And how does she react? She leans back into him, but completely confusing with profound peace. It's a chilling final lesson. The victor of any war is not the one who strikes first. Writes the history at the very end. Freeze the frame right here. Notice the amber light warming the floorboards. Outside, a frozen world decays, but inside, the fire burns a steady red. Upstairs, in the quiet shadows, their children breathe softly into their pillows. Those kids have no idea the gentle hands tucking them in belong to cold, ruthless predators. They sleep wrapped in a fragile lie, guarded by two lovers who tore each other to shreds before fusing the bloody pieces back together. Look at the weary relief in his shoulders as he pulls her close. For these bruised souls, this tragic compromise is their ultimate salvation. It leaves us with a hard truth to carry. Sometimes, the only genuine peace we will ever find is the quiet sanctuary we manage to build from our own violent wreckage. Another important lesson from the story is that accepting help does not mean surrendering control. After Sarafina leaves the penthouse and moves to Ravenshade House, she wants independence. She wants distance from Dorian S. world and the ability to make decisions for herself. However, when dangerous enemies begin watching her, she must face a difficult truth. Independence does not mean pretending danger does not exist. She is pregnant, isolated, and a powerful criminal family through marriage. Completely refusing protection would be emotionally understandable, but practically dangerous. The wise lesson comes through Silas Merrick's advice. She can use Dorian S. security resources while still protecting her autonomy. This is a powerful educational message. In real life, people often think they must choose between total dependence and total isolation. Sarafina shows a more mature path. She negotiates boundaries. She allows guards on the perimeter, but refuses to let them enter her home without permission. She accepts protection, but rejects surveillance. She understands that safety and independence must be balanced carefully. This lesson is especially valuable for anyone leaving a controlling relationship, toxic family, or dangerous environment. Support is important, but it must not become another form of control. Healthy help respects the person being helped. It does not take over their life. Sarafina S. boundaries teach that personal agency can survive even in crisis. She is not naive. She knows threats exist, but she also refuses to let fear turn her back into someone else's possession. Education. Yearly, this encourages viewers to think about consent, boundaries, and practical wisdom. Sometimes we need support, lawyers, security, friends, or family, but receiving support should not erase our voice. A person can be protected and still remain in charge of their own choices. That balance is one of the strongest signs of mature self-respect.